Hey now, everybody, welcome to the Rowdy Wrestling Podcast. I'm Tony Stabile, and 2017 not feeling as good as we thought it would be in the world of pro wrestling, as in a span of, I think, just short of 3 days, we lost three souls in the world of pro wrestling: George the Animal Steele, Nicole Bass, and finally Ivan Koloff, the Russian Bear. And yeah, it's never fun when we have to talk about these things. But I'm a big fan of cementing people's legacies, of speaking about their careers. And as always, Pat Laprade, good old Uncle Pat, is on the show. Quebec wrestling historian. How you doing, Pat?
Very good, very good. Hey, I mean, it's been, you're talking about the last 3 days, but it's been, in a matter of a week or less than 10 days. We also lost Chavo Guerrero Sr. that we talked about on the show. And I mean, if people thought that 2016 was rough on so many people we lost in the world of professional wrestling, I mean, the first that week was like one of the worst sad week that I've ever witnessed. I mean, that's just awful. Like you said, the last 3 days, I mean, every day we're like hearing that someone was actually passing. It was like, wow, I couldn't. It's overwhelming.
Well, of the three, because we had George Animal Steele, Nicole Bass, and Ivan Koloff. George the Animal Steele and Ivan Koloff, I mean, we've been hearing stuff for the past little while. Both of them had made turns for the worst in their health. Nicole Bass came out of the blue, but then again, she'd kind of been out of the spotlight for a little while, so not too many people were paying attention. So it sucks to say we kind of saw some of these things coming, and especially both Ivan and George were, in their 70s, just barely?
Yeah, well,
I think 79 for George.
And 74 for Ivan.
That's still young. I don't like that.
It's still young. I mean, 79 is I mean, in these days, anything before 80 years old is still considered young, but I mean, it's really the matter that they passed away in the span of just a few days. That's what make it even maybe worse, if that makes any sense.
You don't have time to heal from these things. Your child,
no.
In our cases, our childhoods haven't had time to heal from this.
No, definitely not.
All right, so let's go in a weird way, chronological order. I mean, George Steele unfortunately passed away on February 16th. What is it? He died of cancer, liver cancer, or no? That was Ivan Koloff.
No, that was Koloff. Yeah,
Koloff. Him. It was a kidney failure, which, to my knowledge, he didn't have the greatest health. George Animal Steele he had Crohn's disease. They had removed his colon at one point.
Yeah, I mean, George. Yeah, like you said, we knew for a little while that George's health wasn't the best. But you never know when these things, are really going to happen. Some people are taught to, let's take and I talk about that with him, with that person himself. I mean, a guy like Paul Leduc. Who's been, I've been in the business for 15 years, and I've been hearing that he won't, this might be his last year every year, and himself, he's not 80 years old, and for the last 20 years, he's supposed to be passing, so you never know when how far the disease will get into you, and what damages these things are going to do to you. So. It's even though we knew his health wasn't really fine, you still never know when it's going to be your last breath,
Yeah. So George, what I always seem to point out, and whenever I spoke about him, and my dad used to be a big George Animal Steele fan, was that this guy was he presented himself that often. He was a teacher long before he was a pro wrestler, even to the point where he was still teaching well into his career as a wrestler. Had already made some decent to great money just doing summers and other tours, and then eventually, as Ted DiBiase used to say, everybody has a price. Eventually the money became really great and he had to make a choice. I think he made the right choice for selfishly, for entertainment's sakes.
But it was only in the 80s that actually the money was so good. I mean, up until the 80s, he was still he was still doing wrestling as a sideline. That's amazing when you think of it.
Yeah.
Because he's probably one of the best well remembered gimmicks in the rock and wrestling era. When Hulk Hogan came around in 1984. I mean, everybody seems to remember a lot of those personas, like the Coco Bewares, and then George Animal Steels fits into that category as well. I mean, he was unique. Everybody will remember when you're a youngster. You will always remember a guy, hairy guy, bald, hairy guy with a green tongue, eating like the corners of the ring that looks like popcorn to us when we were young, and chasing Elizabeth around the ring, and having Macho Man just going berserk on the animals. I mean, these images, I mean, they will never leave my mind. I mean, I don't know, I was 10-ish, 9, something like that. And I always remember those. And I'm not the only one, So he was that was a gimmick that was so unique that, of course, people will remember that for a long time. What people may not know is that actually George, his real name is Jim Myers, and he, like you said, he was a teacher. He was playing football, back in the days in college, and he was teaching, and he was from Detroit, and he actually started in the '60s in Windsor, Ontario, for and the guy who actually helped him train was Gino Brito. Montreal's Gino Brito, because Gino Brito's father was Jack Britton, the famous promoter who started midget wrestling, and he was partner in the Detroit office with Bert Ruby, and Windsor is just the other side of the border from Detroit, so there was an old church that was closing down, so they bought the church and they opened a gym there. And they started training wrestlers at that gym. So guys like Cowboy Frankie Lane and another guy even more well known than George Animal Steele was Abdullah the Butcher. He started training at that same gym, and it was Gino Brito who actually trained him. And Jim Myers started there. I remember meeting with Mr. Myers. I think it was Amsterdam, New York, for the Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame convention, and he had really, really fond memories, and he was very, very grateful of Gino Brito because he really started him in the business, and from there, after he was he got trained and started wrestling a little, he went to Pittsburgh. And that's where that's where Bruno Sammartino had just bought in the territory in Pittsburgh. He had just he was one of the partners there. Sammartino really, really liked how Steele was working, and from there Sammartino brought him to New York, and that's how he got his break in New York. But before being George Steele, he was simply known as the student, kind of a wink thing, because he was a teacher and he was wrestling under a mask because he didn't want his students to find out, and probably not his students, but also his school to find out he was actually wrestling. You see that sometimes. There was a guy in Montreal back in the '60s who wrestled under a hood as well, because he was working for the city of Montreal, and he didn't want his boss to know about that. So,
well, it's like Jessica Black wrestling, and she's also a teacher. Eventually, I think after about 2 years, a kid pointed out, I was like, "Hey, are you Jessica Black?" And she had to come up because especially in 2015, 2016, 2017, there's no way of hiding it like you could in the 60s and 70s.
No, exactly. I mean, there's a movie about that. Nacho Libre is about a father who was actually a priest. I mean, who was actually wrestling, and he was doing it under a mask. So it's the exact same thing.
I can't believe you just used a Jack Black movie. It hurts.
Hey, well, so I mean that's how he started, as a student, and then became George the Animal Steele, and yeah, I mean he had his WWF days. He was known to be a good promo guy before he came to WWF, but he was like the intelligent monster probably before Brody was, and once he did actually an intelligent promo, if I can name it like that, in as George Animal still in WWF, and Vince Jr. didn't like that at all, because to him he should have not, he was an animal. He should have not be able to talk like that, to talk so smoothly and intelligently like he just did. So that's why his promos were really like sounds more than actually words. But it was the gimmick he had, and he was that's also why we remember him, right? And he was inducted in WWE Hall of Fame in '95 before it really became what it is now. And he did come back in 1998. As part of the oddities, and it was quite fitting actually. Yeah, it was still doing some appearances from time to time, in conventions and stuff like that. And I believe the last time we saw him was in 2010 on a Monday Night Raw. With the WWE actually. So, but yeah, I mean, one of the characters that anybody who followed wrestling in the 1980s will always remember.
Yep. So if the one thing we can suggest is go to the WWE Network, hit up the old 80s shows, him and Macho Man Randy Savage with Miss Elizabeth. I think that was one of my favorite things to look back on, because, that was just watching Miss Elizabeth try and run away in her dresses from George was some of the funniest things you could ever watch.
Oh, yeah, and Savage just going nuts.
Well, Savage was the king of ham, and that was always the best.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, so another unfortunate death that we do have to talk about was Nicole Bass. Not the biggest impact in the world of pro wrestling, much known for her work with, and that's where I knew her from, believe it or not. I didn't remember her in WWE for the longest time, but on the Howard Stern show as one of the regular featured people there.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, she was a bodybuilder that did some stuff with ECW in 1998, and yeah, she did the Howard Stern show, and WWF just took a liking to her because she was for them, she was another China, and they just didn't realize that she was even bigger than China, and it would just kill
the ninth wonder of the world gimmick.
Well, yeah, I mean, they just didn't realize that, because Nicole Bass was like 6'2" maybe, and I mean, she was over 200 pounds. I mean, she was I mean, I remember there were so many rumors at the time that she wasn't really a woman, that she had a transformation or something, in 20 years ago when transformation like this were not something that we that were mainstream, like maybe it is more today, and yeah, and I mean, her wrestling career was just a footnote. She didn't last very long and she wasn't really good at it, and it lasted what, maybe a year, not even, and and she filed a lawsuit against the Fed for sexual harassment, saying that she was sexually assaulted backstage, and finally the case was dismissed, and that was a wrestling career. She had a feud with Deborah McMichael. She aligned herself with Val Venus, and really just a footnote. But because of her size, she's still someone that is remember a lot, and it was the Attitude Era, so everybody was watching wrestling. She not surprisingly, she was like in 2000, the mid 2000s, she was hospitalized for something steroid related, if I remember correctly.
Pancreatitis, yeah, due to
Yeah.
steroids.
So it was, she was only 52 years old. But when you look at her and knowing that she was probably on steroids for like a long, long time, because even when she was in bodybuilding, she was probably, that probably started there. So, yeah, it's not really surprising that she passed away at an early age. But yeah, so Nicole Bass.
Yep, which then brings us to Ivan Koloff, who passed away just on the 18th, yesterday at the time of this recording. Before you get into talking about him, I my personal experience with him is we had him on an older show I used to do, and I didn't get any questions in because I think we asked him 2 questions throughout the maybe 45-minute interview, and Ivan was such a nice guy and such a storyteller that he was able to take the question and then went off on his own thing and went off on his own stories that were just so good and so captivating. And the thing that really did surprise me at that point is that he was telling a story, but in such a soft-spoken manner. He was such a nice guy who pulled no punches. He totally understood what he had done in his life, and even if he had done something bad, he's like, well, that was a product of the time.
Yeah, he was, I met him a few times in Charlotte, North Carolina, and Vegas for the Cauliflower Alley Club. And yeah, he was at the end of his years. He was, he had that religious thing. He was a born again, and usually those people will, be more. They will accept more what they did, and be more maybe truthful about it and understand better what, they will not be in denying mode. They knew what, and he was part of that. He knew what he actually did, and was, just fine talking about it, and be nice and be respectful to the business that, he that made him who he actually was. Koloff has a strong link to Montreal, actually, because and it's just funny. I'll tell you something later, but it's yeah. So he had a strong link to Montreal because he had started wrestling as his real name is Oriol Perez, okay, and he had started wrestling as Red McNulty in the early '60s, and he was really going nowhere. He was working a lot in British Columbia. He was working in Japan as well. And in 1967, Jacques Rougeau Sr. was doing a tour in Japan himself and met with this McNulty guy. And he told him, man, I think you would do a very, very good Russian. We could use you in Montreal. And 1967 is the year where Mad Dog Vachon had started his first big run in Montreal with Baron von Raschke, and Vachon got injured, midway through the year, and he wasn't able to come back, until the beginning of 1968. He wasn't even used in Montreal. He was used. He went back to the United States. So Von Raschke was still here. And I think, that maybe I don't know that for sure, but I think, All Star Wrestling, Johnny Rougeau's promotion, Jacques' brother, maybe they were looking for another Vachon, another great heel. And what better than a Russian? They already had a German with Von Raschke. Russian was even more relevant because it was the Cold War at the time. The Germans was from 20 years before with the Second World War, but the Cold War was still going on, and a Russian would fit perfectly into a heel character, right? So he came in. And they named him Ivan Koloff. Koloff was from Dan Koloff, a former wrestler from the 1930s, who actually worked in Montreal and was involved in the very first Montreal screw job between Henri Deglan and Strangler Lewis. So they named him Ivan Koloff, and he really, really that's really where his career started, And Koloff was always very, very grateful for the Rougeaus. Bertrand Hébert did interview him for the book, actually for both of our books, for the Montreal book as well as the Mad Dog Vachon book. And he was very, very grateful about the Rougeaus for starting him, as Ivan Koloff and giving him that great gimmick the gimmick he was known, pretty much all of his career from now on. And in 1968, the very first year he came in Montreal, he had two huge matches against Johnny Rougeau at the Montreal Forum. The first one was April 8th, I believe, early April, 1968. It was the last wrestling show at the Montreal Forum before the big renovations that the Forum had during that summer. They let the Montreal Canadiens finish their season, and then during the summer they did big renovation to the Forum, adding more seats to the arena, and the Forum opened back on November 2nd, and less than 10 days later, on November 11th, there was a rematch between Koloff and Rougeau, and if the first one had drawn 17,348 people, the second one drew a lot more than that, and thanks to the renovation, because you could fit more people in, and it drew 20,890 people in the Montreal Forum, which was that year, 1968, the biggest wrestling crowd in all of North America. So that's something, and still to this day, it is the biggest crowd in the Montreal Forum for a show not WWE related. The only bigger crowds than this one are the first joint show between International Wrestling and WWF, when the Rougeaus faced the Garvins in the main event. And there's two shows, actually one show from WWE, WWF at the time in '86, Hogan and Morocco, and if I'm not mistaken, so Hogan and Morocco in Montreal once drew. Morocco didn't draw anyone, but Hogan did, and they drew like near 22,000 people. So, it's still from a local standpoint, it is the biggest crowd ever held at the Montreal Forum. So, and that was in 1968, So it was a huge match. Both matches, Johnny Rougeau actually won both of those matches, but Ivan Koloff was now a great heel, and he was, he was used a lot in '68, in '69 as well. Drew a big crowd with Jacques Rougeau in September of '69, 16,000 people, which was one of the biggest crowds of the year in Montreal. And then when eventually he went to New York because Bruno Sammartino wanted to. The schedule was too tough, on Bruno, and he wanted to give up the title, the WWF title at the time. And he was champion since 1963, and in January of '71, Koloff faced Sammartino at Madison Square Garden in New York and pinned him with a knee drop from the top rope. And, just like that, he ended, Sammartino's 7 years reign. And he was just a transitional champion because the champion that McMahon Sr. wanted at the time was Pedro Morales. And Pedro actually beat Koloff 3 weeks later. But I mean, Koloff was still, WWF champion for those 3 weeks, a huge accomplishment at the time. And it's funny because they were fearing that Koloff would create a riot at MSG at the time, and it completely went the other way in the sense that the crowd went just dead silence. It was dead silent. You couldn't hear a thing in MSG. You could see women crying because Bruno had lost.
Doesn't like Bruno have that like really big quote where he's like, "I thought I blew out my eardrums because I didn't hear anything."
Exactly. That was the match, and it's kind of funny in the sense that in the same sense when Morales lost the title a few years, 3 years later, I believe, he lost it to a guy from Quebec, Stan Stasiak.
Yeah.
And again, McMahon thought that Stasiak's win would actually create a riot, so they didn't even announce the title change in the ring. They only said something like, "Well, let's give it up for Pedro Morales." So some people didn't even realize that it was a title change because they didn't announce it in the ring, fearing that a riot would be, the fans would riot about it. So both times there was just no riots, So it's funny how people sometimes imagine, what actually can happen. Pretty much like Brett, who thought that losing the title in Montreal against Shawn Michaels would have caused a riot, which preposterous when you really think about it. So anyway, I digress here, but to come back on Ivan Koloff, he was made, from that point on, he was made, still work, he didn't work in New York after that for a while. But started working everywhere else, Georgia, Florida, Mid-Atlantic. He worked a lot in tag teams with other, Russians, quote unquote Russians, like Crusher Khrushchev, who became, part of the Demolition Act. Was smashed and demolished, and Barry Darsow a few years later. He also teamed with another guy from Quebec, Alexis Smirnoff, who actually was Michel Justice Dubois here in Montreal. He also teamed with his. He had the same relation we have in the sense that he had a fake nephew in Nikita Koloff. So So yeah, and I mean from there, I mean, he was always, one of the good heels to have, and he wrestled until what, the late 80s, early 90s. Um, what I want to make sure that fans understand is you're gonna read pretty much everywhere that Ivan Koloff was born in Montreal, which was not the case. Even if you read it, uh, it doesn't matter where you read it. It wasn't the case. We talked to him. He was actually born in Ontario. He was, a French. In French, we say Franco-Ontarien, a French Canadian from Ontario. Um, and I mean, I don't think his French was ever any good. But and I don't think that he was. I don't know. You did. I don't remember that he actually talked to us in French.
I never
Did
heard
did
him
he
speak
when
French.
you? No, exactly.
No.
So and I asked Gino Brito, and he didn't remember Koloff speaking French. So I guess his French days was maybe when he was a kid. Uh, but yeah, so he was not born in Montreal. And what's funny is that even on his Wikipedia page, when he passed away, it said that he was actually born in Montreal. And I was like, man, every media will pick up the Wikipedia page thinking that it was the truth. And folks, Wikipedia is not always right, especially in wrestling.
Oh yeah.
I don't know for the rest, but for wrestling, it's really, really bad.
Well, I can
And it's funny
confirm. I
because
just checked it now. They're
today,
saying Ottawa.
I know, and that's what I was about to say. I checked it today, and it now says that he was born in Ottawa. He was born in a farm in Ontario, and yeah. So I mean, I'm glad that it's now changed because he wasn't born in Montreal. Although Montreal was a huge part of his career, of course.
Naturally, I mean, without it, we wouldn't have the Russian Bear as he was known.
Yeah, so I mean, a great loss. I mean, he was inducted in the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame, in the Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame in Amsterdam. He was, of course, in the Quebec Wrestling Hall of Fame as well. So a great loss. I mean, one of the great heels. In the '70s, with probably guys like superstar Billy Graham, one of the best heels of the 1970s, and it was used, as I said, in Mid Atlantic. Ole Anderson used him a lot in Georgia, and he worked in California as well. He worked pretty much everywhere. Japan, of course, went to Japan. Had great stories with Mad Dog Vachon in Japan, because he liked to party. Koloff was known for that. Booze and drugs were not strangers to him, and he died from a liver cancer. Which says a lot. And yeah, so wild parties and wild nights, especially in Japan. That's there's actually one good story where Mad Dog Vachon and Koloff were in Japan together, and I mean, both of them didn't quite remember what happened the next day, but it was quite hectic, and we tell the story in the book, and I mean, so that was just one of many nights. Where Koloff, would just party, and probably, you never know, maybe he would have had an even better career if it wasn't for that. But still, he had a Hall of Fame career, and I don't think he expected that. You never know. He was going nowhere as a Red Minority gimmick, and just Jacques Rougeau told him to come to Montreal, become a Russian, and it changed his life. Maybe as Red Minority, he would have quit wrestling a few years later, but now as Ivan Koloff, he became that great Russian heel, and it really, really clicked, and So another great loss. 2017 then starts so bad. It's almost scary to think, what's left, because there's not even 2 months in.
Yeah, I know. I hope not to do too many of these episodes with you. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, though, because, for some people who might not know this, and even me, some episodes, I learn a lot of things when we talk about these guys. So they're good for history, bad for emotion, bad for families and friends. So, I hope I can speak on your behalf. We send our condolences to all their families and friends.
Of
and
course,
fans.
of course. I was really in Las Vegas. I think it was 2013 or 2004. Not 2014. Probably 2013. One or the other. It was the table just next to mine, selling his books and his pictures and stuff like that. And we talked a little, give him a copy of the book, took a picture with me, a picture with the book. He was really, really generous. And so it's just really the time I had to talk to him the most. And like you said, he was very soft spoken and very, but you could see was, in bad shape. He was early 70s and he was really, really in rough shape. But he was, he will be missed in the world of professional wrestling, and as George Animal Steele will be as well. So it's two different eras.
You said it right there.
It's always sad when, and they were still young. They were not as young as some others that we've lost over the past 20 years. It's not Davy Boy Smith kind of young, but it's still pretty young. But these guys lived, such a life of craziness, that one way or the other, it gets back to you one way or the other. So yeah.
Well, sometimes there's only so miles in your odometer, and if you pack them in a couple of years, that's really what it comes down to. And you said it, they lived lives. The stories that have been told and could still be told on what they've done.
Oh yeah, definitely. So hoping that we won't have to do that kind of those kind of calls too often, but at the same time, it's sometimes it sucks, but it's sometimes a way for a new generation of fans to hear about those guys and to learn also about those guys if you take the time to listen to podcasts or read some stuff on them, even if it's a Wikipedia page with some errors on it. At least it gives you a good overview of what these guys' careers were like. And probably that on Monday. Is Koloff in the WWE Hall of Fame? I don't think so. No,
not yet.
No, he's not.
But
he's not.
I hope. It's a shame to say that his passing is something that would push him into the Hall of Fame, but I hope at least at this point they'll start talking about him, because, without that, you wouldn't even have Nikita Koloff's career. So a lot of the 80s, you can thank him for that, 80s, late 80s, and even the beginning of the 90s. So in my mind, it's definitely a Hall of Fame career.
Yeah, and I wonder how WWE will manage that on Monday. Probably the graphic at the beginning of the show, but now they'll have to do one for both. I don't expect them to do one for Nicole Bass.
No.
But George Animal Steele for sure, and I hope Ivan Koloff as well. That would be a slap in the face not to do a graphic. And let's see if they do. Maybe I would expect maybe them to do a video
of George
of George, and you never know. But, well, I don't think they'll do anything for Koloff. But I haven't checked yet. But does the match between Koloff and San Martino on the network? Or
I think it does, because you have the Bruno documentary.
Yeah, you're right.
And
you're right.
that's such a huge part of it, because that's like the midpoint of the documentary in itself, is him talking about it. So I really hope so. If not, like, listen, guys, we live in the 21st century. I'm not your father. I'm not going to tell you to pirate stuff. Just get your eyes on some of this. Specifically that match. It wasn't a spectacular match, but it's a spectacular moment that WWE tried to recreate at WrestleMania between Brock and Goldberg. I think for emotion's sakes, it was almost the same, but just two different generations, if you understand what I mean.
So yeah, I mean, it's there. Just check those videos out, and especially like you said, the Steele stuff with Macho Man and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, we'll two great stars that the world of wrestling have lost, and.
Well, we'll leave it at that, and I really want to thank you for coming on the show. Guys, go check out any of Pat's books. They're all available online, or anytime you see him somewhere, harass him, make him sell you a
Please
book.
Please don't. But yeah, we have a chapter in both the French and English version of our Montreal book, Matt Does Midgets and Screwjobs, or À la semaine prochaine, si Dieu le veut. We talk about Koloff and the Mad Dog Vachon biography as well. That will be released in English in September. We got the month now, so September the Vachon book will be out in English, and yeah. So check those out. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram at Pat Laprade. And thanks, Tony, for having me.
Well, thank you for joining me, and thanks everybody. I'll see you all next time. Thanks for downloading today's episode. If you're new around here and like what you've heard, hit that like button and slap the subscribe one too. Leave me a comment and tell me what you thought, and I'll see all of you next time. Check out our wonderful sponsors, heelsandfaces.com. Those good brothers are here with their pro wrestling inspired threads to make you look too sweet as a pro wrestling fan. Head on over to heelsandfaces.com, buy some shirts and apparel, and most importantly, support indie pro wrestling, is what those guys do every single week when they support this podcast. Pick up the exclusive Rowdy Wrestling Podcast t-shirt only at heelsandfaces.com.